So when I was 23 years old, I received an unexpected call one day. The person at the other end of the line was a well-known editor in one of the major publishing houses in Turkey. I had written my first novel and sent it to this publishing house with a kind of courage that is unique to the inexperienced or the ignorant or both. And now, months later, there was this editor telling me he had read the novel and liked it very much. He said they would like to publish it, and he thought it was a good idea to give me a call and congratulate me in person, personally. And then he asked me if I was happy, and then he asked me if I was okay, and there was no response from me to either question, not a single sound. Somehow my tongue had betrayed me and I couldn't talk. After I hung up the phone, I wrote him a letter, as there were no emails back then, explaining my joy and thanking him. But I could not explain the awkward silence on the phone. I could not confess that sometimes this happened to me, that sometimes the ground beneath my feet opened up and I found myself tumbling all the way down into a pit of anxiety. Nevertheless, the novel came out, and like all books, all novels, it had its own destiny, it had its own journey, separate from the life of the author, and it did well in Turkey. When my second novel was finished, I decided not to mail it, not to send it via mail, but to take it to the editor in person. I'd been working on this book for more than a year, and now I was feeling uncomfortable because it was time to say goodbye to the characters I knew so well and I had come to love. So I went to Istanbul and I found myself in this very old, noisy and overcrowded neighborhood close in the old quarter of the city. And I had to walk towards over the bridge of Galata. And as I was walking, this is more or less what I saw there. Lots of men, side by side, standing still with fishing rods in their hands, just waiting for a fish that might or might not come. Whereas in the meantime, in contrast to their stillness, I was rushing, almost running, because I was feeling the first symptoms of yet another anxiety attack. And I had to be quicker than my angst and take this manuscript to the publishing house, which was only a few feet away. However, my right leg, just like my tongue had done in the past, my right leg betrayed me and it stopped moving. So I was rooted to the spot. I couldn't walk, so much so that I had to hail a cab, pull myself into the cab, carry myself to a doctor who prescribed me a lot of Xanax and told me it was okay, that I had to let go of the novel. Nonetheless, I was able to come back to the Bridge of Galata and take the manuscript to the publishing house before 6 p.m., just before they closed. So I just left it there, the novel that I've been working on day and night. On the way back, again I had to walk over the Bridge of Galata, and this time, this is more or less what I saw there. They were so happy, so relaxed, I looked at them. In fact, I looked at their buckets to see how many fish they had been able to catch throughout the day. And I only saw a few tiny dead fish, nothing more. But by the look on their face, you would think that they had found a treasure. It puzzled me, their contentment, their satisfaction. They clearly had possessed something that I myself lacked. And I'm going to call that an unschooled, spontaneous Epicureanism. The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, as you know, thought that was the most important thing in life was mental pleasure, not physical necessarily, mental pleasure. And he thought that in order to achieve that status, we had to free ourselves of all kinds of anxiety and mental torture. So many years have passed since I stood on the Bridge of Galata watching the fishermen, and since then I have been to many cities, but I was not able to find a writer who has completely freed himself or herself from all kinds of mental torture. In fact, I am yet to see a creative person who is a true, ardent, absolute follower of Epicurus. And because Epicurus himself wanted to stay away from society and politics, people tend to think he was an introvert. But as an introvert myself, I don't think he was one of us. I don't think being an introvert means being antisocial. Sometimes people mistake it for shyness. I don't think it's shyness, being shy or timid, or lacking chutzpah either. All these descriptions seem inaccurate to me. For me, an introvert is someone for whom the space within is bigger and deeper and perhaps more interesting than the world outside. And that is why introverts they never get bored when they're alone. But it's very difficult to explain this to extroverts. The interesting thing is, back then, all of my friends, my close friends, were radical extroverts. And they also happened to be leftists, liberals, nihilists, anarcho-pacifists. We used to gather in bohemian cafes. We used to drink lots of strong Turkish coffee. We would smoke a lot, sulk a lot, and talk about politics all the time. And one of the books that was very popular among us, that was widely circulated, was a book entitled The Right to be Lazy. This is a book written by Paul Lafargue, who, as you know, is the son-in-law of Karl Marx. And in his book, he commended, he praised laziness and idleness, and he was very critical of work. My friends and I, we loved this book. Most of my friends loved this book. It was very sexy and groovy and cool to be lazy. We even made posters to spread the message. But deep inside, I felt a little bit uncomfortable because here was Paul Lafargue telling me not to work, not to write, because work means writing for me, when writing and working was the only thing that kept me balanced and kept me sane and kept my pieces together. So I was not a fan of Epicurus, and I was not a fan of Paul Lafargue either. And in this state, I arrived in Istanbul. I decided to move to Istanbul, thinking that the city was calling me. And I think when we arrive in a city for the first time, there's a crazy energy that comes to us. We want to do so many things. We want to discover so many things. So in this state, I started running from one place to another, trying to multitask, sometimes failing miserably, but always trying again and again. And as I would be running back and forth from one place to another, I would pass by these men sitting in tea houses, coffee houses, mosque courtyards, or parks, just sitting, smoking shisha, eating sunflower seeds, watching the waves, watching the fountains, or watching the pedestrians, seemingly doing nothing. I was in awe of them, I studied them as if they came from a different planet. And it wasn't only in Istanbul. All across the Middle East, if you travel, you will come across thousands and thousands of men, and always men, just sitting, playing backgammon, chatting, smoking mostly, until it's time to go home. In the meantime, women are always working, whether in the public space or the private space, but you won't see, it's very rare to see women sitting in that comfortable position. And I am also aware that there's a very sad rate of unemployment statistics, which doesn't help the situation. But in my opinion, the cult of Epicurus and the cult of Paul Lafargue in the Middle East cannot be solely explained by looking at unemployment statistics. There's something additional, something else, maybe something cultural. So it puzzled me, I wanted to understand this puzzle. And also, please don't get me wrong, there are obviously so many hardworking people all over the Middle East. But all I'm saying is, in addition to these very hardworking people, there's a very visible culture of male idleness, male laziness, almost inertia. And this is puzzling to me. So looking at this background, looking at this framework, I became interested in particularly male scholars coming from the Middle East, or male artists who run against this tide, who were, committed, devoted to their works, who love their works passionately. I wanted to discover these people. And I'm not exactly talking about being a workaholic or, trying to craving money or bonus points or status. What I'm interested in is people who just can't stand still, who want to go beyond the boundaries, beyond the frontiers that are drawn in front of them. And I call them the learners, people who love learning. So I try to find male scholars and artists, past and present, who were learners. And as I kept looking for them, I came across the ghost of an amazing architect. His name is Sinan. And I wrote about him in my recent novel. Today, if you go to Istanbul, almost all of the mosques that Turkey is proud of actually were built by him. Sinan left behind more than 350 monuments. He was amazingly productive. He almost couldn't stop working despite old age, even when his health deteriorated, against the power, the pressure from very authoritarian rulers. Despite the ignorance of the masses, he just kept working and producing. He was amazingly creative. He believed, he wanted to make his work perfect, but he did not think that the artist himself could be perfect. So he would deliberately leave a flaw, a mistake in every one of his monuments. Something deliberately wrong, just to remind himself that even though he was creating, even though he was creative, he was not the creator. And today, in Turkey, not many people recognize this or know this, but Sinan himself was born a Christian. He was most probably Armenian or Greek. Because he was so diligent and hardworking, he became the chief royal architect very fast. And when he became the chief royal architect, he was asked to build bigger domes for Islam, domes that would surpass the dome of Hagia Sophia. But in my opinion, Sinan saw the dome as an all-embracing metaphor, as an all-embracing concept, because he says, under the same invisible dome, there's equal space for all of us, for Muslims, Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. So I became very interested in his personality. And also I became interested in another person who lived around the same time, and that is an astronomer, an Arab astronomer, in fact, called Taqiyuddin. Very briefly, he was also passionate about science, the skies, observing the skies. And he managed to convince the Sultan that there should be an observatory built in Istanbul. This was going to be a hub of science and learning, drawing people from everywhere. There was an amazing library inside. But a few months later, a comet appeared in the skies with a bright, long tail. And Taqiyuddin thought, when asked to interpret it, he said it would be a harbinger of good tidings. In fact, that year turned to be a very bad year for the Ottomans. So the ulema, who were the religious men, seeing an opportunity, they said to the Sultan, you see, this is what happens when we observe the skies. It should be the other way around. Allah should be observing us, not we observing the skies. This is sacrilege. So that observatory, with all the instruments, all the libraries inside, was demolished, was razed and gone. So clearly, in lands such as Turkey, creativity is stifled, it's not encouraged. But to me, it's very important that through people like Sinan, through people like Taqiyuddin, nonetheless, creativity manages to persevere, and bounce back and survive. And seeing people like them gives me inspiration. As a woman writer, I feel inspired by their existence. So there are a few rules, a few principles that I learned ever since that day on the bridge of Galata, and I want to share these with you. These are rules that helped me to be, hopefully, more creative. I think one of them, rule number 1, is beware of comets. The inexplicable, the unknown, things that we cannot control in this life. Don't try to control them. They are there. They appear and then disappear as fast as they had come. And I think we also have to recognize that if we love what we do, you know, it's not a job anymore. It's not a burden. So, for instance, as Confucius said, and I think as Sinan and Takiyetin would testify, if you choose a job that you love, you won't have to work a day in your life. Or as Rumi would say more than 800 years ago, we have to let the beauty we love be what we do. Thank you.